Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The boy or girl paradox. A family has two children, and you're told that at least one of them is a boy. And the question is posed, what is the probability that both children are boys? And the intuitive answer is 1/2, because the other child is either a boy or a girl with equal probability, but this reasoning is incorrect. The actual probability is 1/3. And this is the boy or girl paradox, a puzzle in conditional probability that has generated confusion and debate for decades, with different versions yielding different answers depending on exactly how the information is obtained and what assumptions are made about the selection process. The solution proceeds by considering all possible, equally likely combinations of two children. There are 4 possibilities: boy-boy, boy-girl, girl-boy, girl-girl, and girl-girl, where the order matters because the first child and second child are distinct, even if both are boys or both are girls. And if we are told that at least one child is a boy, then the girl-girl possibility is eliminated, leaving 3 equally likely cases: boy-boy, boy-girl, and girl-boy. And only in one of these 3 cases are both children boys, and so the probability is 1/3, not 1/2. The paradox arises because the conditioning statement, at least one is a boy, is not the same as knowing the gender of a specific child. If instead we are told that the older child is a boy or the younger child is a boy, then the probability that both are boys becomes 1/2, because we are conditioning on a specific child being a boy rather than on the existential claim that at least one child somewhere in the family is a boy. And this distinction, subtle as it seems, makes a crucial difference to the probability calculation. The boy or girl paradox has many variations that probe the boundaries of the problem and reveal how sensitive the answer is to the exact specification of the scenario. One famous variant involves meeting a man who says he has 2 children, and one of them is a boy named Tuesday, meaning the boy was born on a Tuesday, and this additional information about the day of the week changes the probabilities in a surprising way, because it reduces the number of scenarios consistent with the statement, and the probability that both children are boys increases from 1/3 to 13/27. And this result seems bizarre, seems like the day of the week should be irrelevant, but the mathematics is sound. The additional specificity affects the conditional probabilities. Another variation asks, what if you meet a man with 2 children, and you see one of them, a boy? Does this change the answer? And the answer is yes. Seeing a specific boy is different from being told that at least one child is a boy, because seeing introduces selection effects. You are more likely to see a boy in families with 2 boys than in families with 1 boy, and so the probability calculation must account for the process by which the information was obtained, and different processes lead to different answers. And this sensitivity to selection effects is a general feature of conditional probability problems. And it explains why the boy or girl paradox has multiple defensible answers depending on the scenario. The paradox connects to the reference class problem and to debates about the principle of indifference, because applying the principle of indifference requires specifying a reference class, a set of equally likely outcomes, and different choices of reference class lead to different probability assignments. And in the boy or girl paradox, the reference class could be families with at least 1 boy, or it could be situations where someone tells you that at least one child is a boy. And these are different reference classes with different probabilities. And there is no neutral or obvious way to choose between them without more information about how the scenario is set up. The paradox also raises questions about the interpretation of probability statements in natural language. because phrases like, "at least one is a boy," can be interpreted in different ways, as a statement about the existence of a boy in the family, as a statement about what someone knows or has observed, or as a statement about what information has been communicated, and each interpretation leads to different formal models and different probability calculations. And this ambiguity in natural language is a source of many probability paradoxes, where the mathematical answer depends on details that are not fully specified in the informal statement of the problem. Bayesian statisticians and frequentists also interpret the paradox differently. Bayesians treat probability as degrees of belief and calculate conditional probabilities using Bayes' theorem, while frequentists treat probability as long-run frequencies and may question whether the conditional probability is well defined without specifying a clear sampling procedure. And these different philosophical approaches to probability lead to different emphases in how the paradox is understood and resolved, though both traditions agree on the mathematical calculations once the problem is precisely formulated. The boy or girl paradox has practical analogues in genetics and medicine, where the probability of certain conditions depends on family history in ways that are similar to the structure of the paradox. For instance, the probability that a family carries a recessive genetic trait depends on how many children are observed to have the trait, and the calculations must account for ascertainment bias, the fact that families are more likely to come to medical attention if they have affected children, and this bias affects the probability assessments in ways that parallel the selection effects in the boy or girl paradox. The family walks down the street, 2 children beside them, and you know that at least one is a boy, and the question remains, what is the probability that both are boys? And the answer depends on how you came to know this fact, on whether you asked about a specific child or about any child, on whether you saw a boy or were merely told that at least one exists, and each variation of the scenario changes the answer, shifts the probabilities, reveals that conditional probability is sensitive to context, to process, to the mechanisms by which information is acquired and communicated, and the paradox persists as a puzzle, as a teaching tool, as a demonstration of how subtle probability can be, how carefully problems must be formulated, how easily intuition can mislead. And the boy walks ahead, evidence of his existence, shifting probabilities, conditioning beliefs, and the mathematics unfolds, precise and unforgiving, calculating 1/3 or 1/2 or 13/27, depending on the details, and the intuition struggles to keep up, struggles to grasp why the day of the week matters, why seeing is different from being told, why reference classes and selection effects have such profound impacts on what should be simple questions, and the paradox endures, unsettled in the sense that people continue to disagree about which answer is correct for which version, continue to debate whether the problem is well posed, continue to find new variations that test the boundaries of conditional probability, and the family continues walking. The boy or boys or boy and girl continue existing, and the question remains open, answerable only when the scenario is specified with enough precision to eliminate ambiguity, to fix the reference class, to determine the selection process, and until then, the paradox lives on. A reminder that probability is not just mathematics, but interpretation. Not just calculation, but careful attention to how information is obtained, how questions are asked, and how evidence is generated. The card paradox. Imagine a card, simple and rectangular, lying flat on a table, and on one side is written a single sentence. The statement on the other side of this card is true, and already the mind begins to sense danger, a trap being set. The card is flipped over, and on the reverse side another sentence appears. The statement on the other side of this card is false, and now the contradiction is complete. A perfect loop of mutual negation that cannot be resolved no matter how many times the card is turned. If the first side is true, then the second side must be true, as the first side claims, but if the second side is true, then the first side must be false, as the second side claims, which contradicts the assumption that the first side is true. And if the first side is false, then the second side must be false, as the first side incorrectly claims it is true. But if the second side is false, then the first side must be true, as the second side incorrectly claims it is false, and the cycle spirals endlessly without rest. The card paradox is a variation of the liar paradox, but its physical form makes the contradiction feel more tangible, more concrete, a paradox that can be held in the hand and turned over and over as if repetition might somehow reveal a hidden answer that logic cannot provide. The paradox demonstrates how self-reference can be distributed across multiple statements rather than contained in a single sentence, showing that contradictions do not need to be immediate or obvious to be genuine, that they can emerge from relationships between statements rather than from the statements themselves. Philip Jourdan, a mathematician and logician, is often credited with popularizing this version of the paradox in the early 20th century, using it to explore the limits of truth and reference, and to illustrate the kinds of problems that plagued attempts to formalize logic and mathematics during that era. The card paradox also reveals something about the nature of truth itself, the way that truth is not a property that statements possess in isolation, but a relationship between statements and the world, or between statements and other statements. And when those relationships form closed loops, the concept of truth begins to break down. Some philosophers argue that the statements on the card are neither true nor false, but meaningless, that they fail to refer to anything outside themselves and therefore do not qualify as genuine propositions, while others suggest that the paradox exposes a flaw in the classical assumption that every statement must be either true or false, that perhaps some statements occupy a third category, undefined or indeterminate. The card sits on the table, innocent and menacing, a small object that contains an infinite problem, and no amount of flipping will resolve what is written on its surfaces. No clever interpretation will untangle the knot, and so it remains, a monument to the limits of language and logic, a reminder that not all questions have answers, that some truths are forever out of reach, caught in loops that reason cannot break. The crocodile dilemma, when a monster's promise makes truth deadly. A crocodile seizes a child from the riverbank, snatches the infant in its jaws, and the mother screams and begs for her child's return, and the crocodile, cunning and cruel, makes an offer. The crocodile says, "I will return your child if you correctly predict what I will do, if you say truly whether I will return the child or not." And the mother must choose, must predict the crocodile's action, and if she predicts correctly, she gets her child back, and if she predicts incorrectly, the crocodile keeps the child. And this seems straightforward at first, seems like a gamble with 50-50 odds. But the mother is clever, thinks carefully, and realizes she can construct a prediction that creates a paradox. And she says to the crocodile, "You will not return my child." And now the crocodile faces an impossible choice, a logical trap from which there is no escape. And this is the crocodile dilemma, an ancient paradox from Greek and Roman philosophy that illustrates how self-reference and promises can generate contradictions that have no resolution. Imagine the crocodile processing the mother's prediction. She has said, the crocodile will not return the child, and the crocodile must decide whether this prediction is true or false. And if the prediction is true, then the crocodile will not return the child, but the promise was to return the child. If the prediction is correct, and the prediction is correct, so the crocodile must return the child. But returning the child makes the prediction false, because the prediction said the child would not be returned. And if the prediction is false, then the crocodile is not obligated to return the child, but not returning the child makes the prediction true. And if it is true, the crocodile must return the child, and the cycle repeats. And the crocodile is stuck, unable to act, unable to fulfill the promise without violating it, unable to violate it without fulfilling it. and the paradox is complete. Visualize the crocodile frozen at the water's edge, jaws clamped around the child, mind caught in a logical loop, every option leading to contradiction, and the mother waits, and the crocodile cannot move forward or backward, cannot return the child or keep the child without creating impossibility. And the promise that seemed simple, seemed like a straightforward conditional, has become a trap, has revealed that some promises are unkeepable, some conditionals are incoherent when their conditions refer to their own fulfillment. The dilemma is structurally similar to the liar paradox, involves self-reference creating contradiction, because the mother's prediction refers to the crocodile's action, and the crocodile's action depends on whether the prediction is true, and the prediction's truth depends on the action. And this circular dependency creates a situation where no consistent assignment of truth values is possible, where any choice by the crocodile contradicts the conditions of the promise. And the paradox shows that not all promises can be kept, not all conditionals can be satisfied, especially when the condition refers to the action that depends on the condition. One proposed resolution is that the crocodile's promise is defective, is not a genuine promise, but a linguistic trick, because promises must be performable, must create obligations that can be fulfilled, and the crocodile's promise creates an obligation that cannot be fulfilled when the mother makes the strategic prediction, and so the promise is void. The crocodile is not bound by it, and the crocodile can do whatever it chooses without violating any obligation, and by this resolution, the crocodile keeps the child, the mother loses. Not because her prediction was wrong, but because she made a prediction that made the promise unenforceable, and the dilemma is resolved by rejecting the premise that the promise binds the crocodile in paradoxical cases. Another resolution distinguishes between the crocodile's intentions at the moment of making the promise and the actual outcome, and argues that the promise should be interpreted as concerning the crocodile's intended action, not the final action after considering the prediction, and when the mother predicts the child will not be returned, the crocodile evaluates whether to intend to return the child, and if the crocodile's initial intention is not to return the child, then the prediction is correct, and the crocodile should return the child according to the promise. And this return action does not create a contradiction, because the promise was about the intention, not about the final action. But this resolution seems strained, seems to reinterpret the promise in ways that were not clearly intended. And it is not obvious that distinguishing intention from action resolves the paradox or merely shifts it. A third resolution embraces the paradox and argues that it shows the limits of what can be promised, that some conditionals are inherently problematic, that promises whose conditions involve self-reference or depend on the promiser's response to the condition create logical tangles that cannot be resolved, and rational agents should avoid making such promises, should recognize that not every grammatically well-formed conditional statement creates a genuine obligation, and the crocodile's mistake was offering a promise whose structure allowed paradoxical predictions. And once the paradox emerges, the crocodile is released from the promise, is in a situation where any action is permissible because no action can satisfy the promise, and morality and logic give no guidance. The crocodile dilemma also illustrates issues in game theory and strategic reasoning, because the mother is using her prediction strategically, choosing her words not to convey her genuine belief about what the crocodile will do, but to create a situation where the crocodile cannot win. And this strategic use of language, using predictions not to predict, but to constrain, appears in negotiations, legal arguments, and political discourse, where statements are crafted to create binds, to force opponents into positions where any response is disadvantageous, and the dilemma shows that self-referential statements can be weapons, can be used to trap others in paradoxes where no good option exists. The dilemma has modern variants involving computers and artificial intelligence, where programs might be given instructions that are self-referential, that depend on the program's own output in ways that create paradox, and programmers must be careful to avoid such loops, must ensure that conditionals do not refer to their own evaluation in ways that create infinite regress or contradiction. And the crocodile dilemma serves as a warning, a reminder that self-reference is dangerous, creates problems that cannot always be resolved by cleverness or by trying harder, but only by recognizing the structure and avoiding it. The child hangs in the crocodile's jaws. The mother waits for an answer, and the crocodile is paralyzed by logic, cannot move without contradiction, and the ancient paradox remains, unsolved, unresolvable, a trap that philosophy has not escaped, a reminder that language can create impossibilities, that promises can be unkeepable, that self-reference generates paradoxes that defy solution, and the crocodile dilemma endures, taught in logic classes, discussed in philosophy seminars, a vivid example of how words can bind more tightly than chains, how a simple promise can become an impossible obligation, and how the combination of self-reference and conditionality creates contradictions from which there is no escape, and the crocodile remains frozen, the child unclaimed, and the paradox persists, waiting at the riverbank for the next clever victim to spring the trap. The binding problem: how your brain unites what it processes separately. A neuroscientist examines how the brain processes visual information, discovers that different features of objects are processed in different brain regions. Color is processed in one area, motion in another, shape in a third, orientation in a fourth, and all these features are analyzed separately, by specialized modules, by distinct populations of neurons. And yet when you look at a red ball moving to the right, you do not experience color, motion, and shape as separate. Do not see redness here and roundness there and rightward motion elsewhere, but see a unified object, a red round ball moving right, and all the features are bound together, are experienced as properties of a single thing. And this creates the binding problem, the puzzle of how the brain, which processes features separately, creates unified conscious experiences, how separate neural processes give rise to integrated perception, how the many become one. And this problem is fundamental, touches on the nature of consciousness, on how neural activity becomes experience, on what unifies experience into coherent wholes, and no complete solution exists. Various theories have been proposed, but the binding problem remains one of the deep mysteries of neuroscience, a gap between our understanding of neural processing and our understanding of consciousness. Imagine the visual system as a factory, with different departments processing different aspects of the product. One department handles color, another handles shape, another handles location, and all work in parallel, all process simultaneously, and each department produces its output color information, shape information, location information, and somehow these separate outputs must be combined, must be integrated into a unified representation, must be bound together so that you experience a red ball rather than redness and roundness as separate unlocalized features. And the binding problem asks how this combination occurs, what mechanism ensures that the right features are bound together, that the redness is attributed to the round object and not to the square object that happens to be present in the scene. And this correct attribution, this accurate binding, is critical for coherent perception, for navigating the world successfully, and yet how the brain achieves it remains unclear. The binding problem has two aspects: the feature binding problem, which asks how different features of the same object are bound together, and the object binding problem, which asks how different objects are kept separate, are not confused with each other, and both aspects are challenging. Both reveal that perceptual unity is not given automatically by neural processing, but requires some mechanism, some process that groups features appropriately, and various mechanisms have been proposed. Attention has been suggested as a solution. The idea that attention binds features that attended objects have their features integrated, while unattended objects do not. And this explains why feature binding errors occur when attention is diverted, why illusory conjunctions occur where features from different objects are misbound, are attributed incorrectly. Visualize attention as a spotlight that illuminates objects one at a time, and within the spotlight features are bound, are integrated, and outside the spotlight features remain separate, are not integrated, and this attentional binding theory has some support, has experimental evidence showing that feature binding requires attention, that without attention, features can be perceived separately without being bound correctly, and illusory conjunctions are more common under conditions of inattention, supporting the idea that attention is necessary for binding. But attention cannot be the complete solution, because some binding occurs pre-attentively. Some feature integration happens automatically before attention is applied, and so attention is part of the story, but not the whole story. Another proposed mechanism is temporal synchrony, the idea that neurons representing features of the same object fire in synchrony, fire together, and this synchrony is the binding code, is what marks features as belonging together and neurons representing different objects, fire at different times or with different phases, and this temporal separation keeps objects distinct, prevents their features from being bound together. And this synchrony theory has been influential, has generated extensive research, has led to discovery of synchronized neural oscillations in visual cortex, but the theory faces challenges. It is not clear that synchrony is sufficient for binding, it is not clear that consciousness depends on synchrony, and some experiments have failed to find the predicted correlations between synchrony and perceptual binding, and the theory remains controversial. A third approach argues that binding occurs through convergence, through hierarchical processing, where features are combined in higher-level areas, and early visual areas process features separately, but project to higher areas that represent combinations, that have neurons responding to specific conjunctions of features. And these conjunction neurons represent bound objects, represent integrated wholes, and binding is achieved through this hierarchical architecture, through neurons that explicitly encode feature combinations. And this approach has support from single neuron recordings showing that higher visual areas have neurons with complex selectivity, neurons that respond to specific combinations of shape and color and motion, and these neurons could be the neural basis of bound object representations. The binding problem also connects to consciousness, because unified conscious experience seems to require binding, seems to require that separate neural processes be integrated into coherent wholes, and some theories of consciousness, like integrated information theory, make integration central, argue that consciousness arises from integrated information, from systems where different parts interact and constrain each other, and binding as a form of integration is the combination of separately processed features into unified representations. And understanding binding may be crucial for understanding consciousness, may reveal how neural processes give rise to unified experience. The problem also has practical implications. For understanding neurological conditions where binding fails, where patients see features but cannot bind them correctly, and such conditions exist. Barlint's syndrome is one example, where patients can see individual features but cannot perceive objects, cannot integrate features into wholes. And these patients provide evidence that binding is a genuine process, is not automatic, can be disrupted by brain damage. And studying these patients helps understand normal binding, helps identify the brain regions and processes necessary for feature integration. Some philosophers argue that the binding problem is really a problem about consciousness, about how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, about the hard problem, and binding is one aspect of this, is the problem of how separate neural processes give rise to unified conscious experiences. And solving the binding problem may require solving the hard problem, may require understanding how neural activity becomes experience, and this makes binding one of the deepest problems in neuroscience, a problem at the interface between neuroscience and philosophy of mind. The brain processes features separately, colour here, motion there, shape elsewhere, and yet you see unified objects, see red round balls moving, see integrated wholes, and how this integration occurs, how the separate processes give rise to unified experiences, remains one of the great unsolved problems. The binding problem stands, challenging, fundamental, revealing a gap between our understanding of neural processing and our understanding of perception. And various theories exist, various mechanisms have been proposed. Attention, synchrony, convergence, but no theory is complete. No theory explains all aspects of binding, and the problem persists as one of neuroscience's deepest mysteries. A puzzle about how unity emerges from multiplicity, how the brain binds what it processes separately. And the question remains open, the mechanism remains elusive, and the binding problem endures. The Banach-Tarski paradox. A solid sphere can be decomposed into a finite number of pieces, which can then be reassembled, using only rotations and translations, to form two solid spheres, each identical to the original. And this seems to violate conservation of volume, seems to create matter from nothing, seems to be impossible, and yet it is a theorem in mathematics, proven rigorously using the axiom of choice and the properties of infinite point sets. And this is the Banach-Tarski paradox, named after Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski, who proved it in 1924. And the paradox reveals deep and counterintuitive features of infinite decompositions, of non-measurable sets, and of the relationship between mathematics and physical reality. The proof proceeds by decomposing the sphere into a finite number of pieces, typically 5 or 6, and each piece is a set of points, not a solid region with smooth boundaries but a scattered, disconnected, infinitely complex collection of points. And these pieces are non-measurable, meaning they do not have well-defined volumes in the usual sense. They cannot be assigned a size using standard measure theory, and this is crucial because measurable sets cannot be duplicated. Conservation of volume holds for measurable sets, but non-measurable sets escape this constraint. They can be rearranged in ways that seem to violate intuition, and the Banach-Tarski paradox exploits this by constructing pieces that are so pathological, so wildly scattered, that they can be rotated and translated to form two complete spheres. The decomposition uses the axiom of choice, the principle that given any collection of non-empty sets, there exists a way to choose one element from each set, and the axiom of choice is independent of the other axioms of set theory. It cannot be proven or disproven from the standard axioms, and some mathematicians reject it precisely because it leads to results, like the Banach-Tarski paradox, results that seem absurd, and rejecting the axiom of choice avoids the paradox. But it also cripples large parts of modern mathematics. Many important theorems depend on the axiom of choice, and most mathematicians accept it despite its counterintuitive consequences. The paradox applies only to objects in three-dimensional space, or higher, it does not work in 2 dimensions. A disk cannot be decomposed and reassembled into 2 disks. And this is because the group of rotations in the plane is amenable, meaning it admits a certain kind of averaging that prevents paradoxical decompositions, while the group of rotations in 3-dimensional space is non-amenable, and this non-amenability is what makes the Banach-Tarski paradox possible. The fact that rotations in 3 dimensions can be combined in ways that allow pieces to be moved around and duplicated. The paradox raises questions about the relationship between mathematical objects and physical objects, because while the Banach-Tarski theorem is mathematically rigorous, it does not imply that a physical sphere can be duplicated. The decomposition involves infinitely complex sets, pieces that are not solid regions but scattered collections of points, with no smooth boundaries, and such pieces cannot be physically realized, cannot be cut or manipulated, and so the paradox is a feature of mathematical idealizations rather than a claim about physical reality. And this distinction is important. The paradox shows that mathematical spheres treated as sets of points behave in strange ways, but it does not threaten conservation of mass or energy in physics. Because physical objects are not sets of points but arrangements of atoms or fields or quantum states, and these are governed by physical laws that do not permit paradoxical duplication. Some mathematicians and philosophers argue that the Banach-Tarski paradox is not really a paradox but a theorem, a surprising result that reveals features of infinite point sets and non-measurable sets, and that calling it a paradox is misleading, suggesting contradiction when there is none, only counterintuitive behavior. And from this perspective, the paradox is valuable precisely because it challenges intuition, because it shows that infinite collections have properties that finite collections lack, that measure theory has limits, that the axiom of choice has strange consequences, and that mathematics is richer and stranger than naive expectations suggest. Others find the paradox troubling, a sign that something is wrong with the foundations, that the axiom of choice should be rejected or restricted, that non-measurable sets are pathological objects that should not be admitted into mathematics, and that theories which avoid such sets, like those based on constructive or intuitionistic logic, provide better foundations. And this debate reflects deeper disagreements about the nature of mathematical existence, about what kinds of objects mathematics should study, and about the role of intuition in guiding mathematical practice. The Banach-Tarski paradox also appears in discussions of probability and decision theory, because if a sphere can be decomposed into non-measurable pieces, then probability distributions on spheres must be carefully defined to avoid assigning probabilities to non-measurable sets. And this technical requirement reflects the same underlying issue, that not all collections of points can be measured, that probability requires measurability, and that attempting to assign probabilities to arbitrary sets leads to contradictions or paradoxes. The sphere sits on the table, solid and indivisible to the eye, but mathematically it is a set of infinitely many points. And the Banach-Tarski theorem says that these points can be partitioned into pieces, 5 or 6 strange scattered collections, and these pieces can be moved, rotated and translated and reassembled into 2 spheres, identical to the original. And the volume has doubled, or seems to have doubled, but the pieces never had well-defined volumes. They were never measurable, and so nothing has been created, no conservation law has been violated, only the intuition that decomposition preserves size, and this intuition holds for finite decompositions, for measurable pieces, but fails for infinite non-measurable pieces, and the paradox endures, a theorem that sounds impossible, a result that challenges understanding, a demonstration that mathematics contains surprises, that infinity is stranger than imagination, that point sets behave in ways that solid objects do not, and that the axiom of choice, innocent as it seems, permits constructions that defy common sense, and the sphere duplicates, mathematically, if not physically. And the paradox remains a permanent fixture in the landscape of mathematics, a result that students encounter with disbelief, that mathematicians accept as rigorous yet counterintuitive, and that philosophers debate as revealing something deep about the nature of mathematical objects, about the limits of measure theory, about the relationship between infinite idealization and finite reality. And the sphere sits there, unchanged and yet somehow doubled, a monument to the strangeness of infinity, to the power of the axiom of choice, and to the capacity of mathematics to prove truths that seem like impossibilities. The consequence argument, why the past makes your future inevitable. A philosopher constructs a deceptively simple argument about free will and determinism, an argument that has become one of the most influential and most discussed arguments in the free will debate. And the argument is called the consequence argument, formulated most clearly by Peter van Inwagen and the argument aims to show that free will is incompatible with determinism, that if determinism is true, then no one has free will, that our actions are not genuinely up to us but are consequences of the past and the laws of nature, things we cannot control, and the argument proceeds through careful reasoning about what we can and cannot control, about what is and is not up to us, and it concludes that if the past and the laws determine everything, then we determine nothing. We have no control. We are not free. And this is the consequence argument, an argument for incompatibilism, for the view that determinism and free will cannot both be true, and the argument forces compatibilists to explain how we could be free if determinism is true, how our actions could be up to us if they are inevitable consequences of factors beyond our control, and the debate sparked by this argument continues, with philosophers proposing responses, defending premises, clarifying concepts, and the consequence argument remains central to contemporary discussions of free will, a challenge that every theory must address. Imagine the logical structure. Determinism says that the state of the world at any time, plus the laws of nature, entail the state of the world at all future times. Everything that happens is a consequence of what happened before, plus the laws. And now consider your action right now. Reading these words, and if determinism is true, then this action is entailed by the state of the world before you were born, plus the laws of nature, and you have no control over the state of the world before you were born. You did not cause it. You cannot change it. It is a fixed fact about the past, and you have no control over the laws of nature. You did not create them. You cannot alter them. They are what they are, independent of you. And if your action is entailed by things you have no control over, then you have no control over your action. And if you have no control over your action, then you are not free with respect to that action. And this applies to all your actions. All are consequences of the past and the laws, things beyond your control. And so if determinism is true, then you are not free. You have no free will. And this is the consequence argument in its essential form. The argument can be stated more formally using the concept of power, what we have power over, what is up to us. And the argument says that no one has power over the past, no one has power over the laws of nature, no one has power over the fact that the past and the laws entail the present. And therefore, by a transfer principle, if the present is entailed by things we have no power over, then we have no power over the present. And having power over our actions is necessary for free will, and so we lack free will. If determinism is true, and the argument is valid, the conclusion follows from the premises. And so attacking the argument requires attacking one of the premises, requires either denying that we lack power over the past and laws, which seems implausible, or denying the transfer principle, denying that lack of power transfers across entailment. Visualize the causal chain, stretching back into the past, the state of the universe billions of years ago, plus the laws of physics, determined the state 1 second later, and that state, plus the laws determined the next state. And the chain continues, moment by moment, through the formation of galaxies and stars and planets, through the evolution of life, through human history, through your birth and upbringing and this present moment. And at no point in this chain did you have control. You were not there at the beginning. You did not set the initial conditions. You did not write the laws, and the entire chain was set in motion before you existed. And your current action is the end of this chain, is the inevitable consequence of factors you did not control. And the consequence argument says, this shows you are not free. Your action was not genuinely up to you, was determined by the past. Compatibilists respond to the consequence argument in various ways. One response denies the transfer principle, argues that lack of power does not transfer across entailment in the way the argument assumes, that you can have power over a fact even if that fact is entailed by other facts you have no power over. And this response requires specifying what power means, what it is to have something be up to you. And compatibilists argue that an action is up to you if it results from your deliberation, your desires, your character, even if those psychological states were themselves determined by the past. And so the transfer principle is false. Power does not transfer, and the consequence argument fails. Another compatibilist response accepts the transfer principle, but denies that we lack power over the past in the relevant sense, argues that we do have a kind of counterfactual power over the past. We have the power such that if we had chosen differently, then the past would have been different. And this counterfactual power is sufficient for freedom, sufficient for the action to be up to us. And critics respond that counterfactual power is not real power, that being such that if you acted differently, the past would have been different is not the same as being able to act differently. And the compatibilist response confuses conditional ability with genuine ability, confuses what would have happened if things were different with what you can make happen. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between freedom and ultimate responsibility, accepts that the consequence argument shows we lack ultimate responsibility, ultimate control, the kind of control that would make us solely and completely responsible for our actions independent of all prior causes, but argues that we have enough control, enough freedom, for moral responsibility, for being proper subjects of praise and blame. And ultimate responsibility is impossible, is not required for the ordinary kind of responsibility that matters for ethics and law. And the consequence argument shows too much, shows that even libertarians who reject determinism cannot have ultimate responsibility because their actions are either caused by prior states or are random, and neither causation nor randomness gives ultimate responsibility. And so, the consequence argument does not distinguish between compatibilism and libertarianism, does not favour incompatibilism over compatibilism. Incompatibilists defend the consequence argument, defend the transfer principle, argue that compatibilist responses involve sophisticated verbal tricks, redefine freedom in ways that evacuate it of meaning, and the consequence argument reveals that if determinism is true, then we are not truly in control, are not genuinely free, and moral responsibility is undermined. And we must either reject determinism or accept that free will is an illusion, and different incompatibilists choose differently. Some become libertarians and argue that determinism is false, that quantum mechanics or agent causation or emergent properties provide room for free will, and others become hard determinists and accept that free will does not exist, that responsibility is problematic, that praise and blame need reinterpretation. The consequence argument also generates discussions about the fixity of the past, about what it means to say we have no power over the past. Because in one sense this is obvious. We cannot change what has already happened, cannot make it the case that the past was different. But in another sense, our current actions do affect what the past was, because if we act differently now, then the past must have been different given determinism. And so there is a sense in which our actions constrain the past, and compatibilists exploit this to argue that we do have power over the past in the relevant sense, while incompatibilists insist that this is not real power, not the kind of control required for freedom. The argument stands at the centre of free will debates, forces clarification of concepts, forces philosophers to specify what freedom requires, what control means, what power involves, and whether these are compatible with determinism, and the debate is productive, generates insight, even if it does not generate consensus, and the consequence argument remains one of the most powerful arguments for incompatibilism. One of the most difficult challenges for compatibilists to answer, and Van Inwagen's formulation is elegant, is compelling, captures a deep intuition that if everything we do is the inevitable consequence of factors beyond our control, then we are not truly free and the past stretches back, determined and fixed, and the laws operate, inexorable and unchanging, and the present unfolds and the action occurs, and the consequence argument says, this action was not free, was not genuinely up to the agent, was a consequence of things beyond control, and whether this argument succeeds, whether compatibilists can answer it, remains disputed, remains central to contemporary philosophy of free will. The coastline paradox, why no one can agree how long Britain's shore is. A mapmaker sits down to measure the length of the coastline of Great Britain, the perimeter of the island, the total distance around its shores. And this seems like a straightforward task, a matter of careful measurement and calculation. But the paradox is that the answer depends on the scale of measurement, on how closely you look, on what size ruler you use to trace the coast. And as the ruler gets smaller, as the measurement becomes more precise, the measured length increases without bound, growing larger and larger, approaching infinity. And so the coastline has no well-defined length, or rather, its length is infinite. Or rather, the question of length becomes meaningless for highly irregular shapes. And this is the coastline paradox, first articulated clearly by mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot, who used it to motivate the study of fractals, shapes that exhibit self-similarity and complexity at all scales. Imagine measuring the coastline with a 100-kilometer ruler, a straight stick 100 kilometers long, and you walk around the island placing the stick end to end, measuring each straight segment. And when you reach the starting point, you add up all the segments and get a total length, perhaps 4,000 kilometers, and this seems like a reasonable measurement. But now imagine using a 10-kilometer ruler instead, a shorter stick. And because the ruler is shorter, it can follow the bends and curves of the coast more closely. It does not cut across bays and headlands, but traces around them. And when you complete the circuit, the total length is longer, perhaps 5,000 kilometers, because the shorter ruler captures more detail, more twists and turns, that the longer ruler missed. And now imagine using a 1-kilometer ruler, even shorter, and it follows the coast even more closely, entering smaller inlets, tracing around individual rocks and peninsulas, and the measured length increases again, perhaps to 7,000 kilometers. Continue this process using shorter and shorter rulers, a 100-meter ruler, a 10-meter ruler, a 1-meter ruler, and each time the measured length increases, because each shorter ruler reveals new details, new irregularities, new ins and outs that the previous ruler smoothed over, and the coastline is fractal-like, exhibiting structure at every scale. Every time you zoom in, you find new complexity, new bays within bays, new peninsulas jutting from peninsulas. And so there is no scale at which the coast becomes smooth, no level of detail at which further refinement stops revealing new length. And if you continue to arbitrarily small rulers, measuring every pebble, every grain of sand, every molecule, the measured length grows without limit, approaching infinity. And so the coastline paradox concludes that the coastline has infinite length, or more carefully, that the concept of length as traditionally defined does not apply to highly irregular curves like coastlines. Mandelbrot used this paradox to introduce fractals, geometric shapes characterized by self-similarity and non-integer dimension. And he showed that coastlines, along with many other natural shapes like clouds, mountains, rivers and trees, are better described by fractal geometry than by traditional Euclidean geometry. And fractals have a property called fractal dimension, a number that quantifies how much space the shape fills. And for a smooth curve, the dimension is 1. For a surface, the dimension is 2. But for fractals, the dimension can be a non-integer, like 1.2 or 1.5, indicating that the shape is more than a line, but less than a surface. And coastlines typically have fractal dimensions between 1 and 2, reflecting their intricate, space-filling character. The paradox has practical implications for geography and cartography, because if coastline length depends on measurement scale, then different measurements will give different answers. And there is no single correct answer to the question, how long is the coastline of Great Britain? The answer depends on what resolution of map you use, on what level of detail you include, and different countries and agencies use different conventions, sometimes specifying a minimum feature size or a standard ruler length, but these conventions are arbitrary, and different conventions give different lengths. And so coastline length is not an intrinsic property of the coastline, but a relational property that depends on the measurement method. The paradox also raises philosophical questions about measurement and the nature of geometric properties, because it suggests that some shapes do not have well-defined lengths, that the concept of length, which works well for straight lines and smooth curves, breaks down for irregular shapes, and this is not a limitation of our measuring instruments, but a feature of the shapes themselves. And this raises the question of whether length is a fundamental property of all curves, or whether it is a concept that applies only to sufficiently regular curves. And fractals fall outside the domain where traditional geometric concepts apply. Visualize the coast as an infinitely jagged line, with bays and headlands at every scale. Zoom in on a section and you see smaller bays and headlands. Zoom in again and you see even smaller ones. And this pattern repeats forever. There is no smooth coastline at any level of magnification, only more and more detail, and so tracing the coast means following an infinitely intricate path, and the length of an infinitely intricate path is infinite. And this is the essence of the paradox, that complexity at all scales produces infinite length, that irregular shapes are fundamentally different from regular shapes, and that traditional geometry is inadequate to describe them. The coastline paradox also appears in other contexts, in measuring the length of borders between countries, in measuring the perimeter of cells or the surface area of lungs, both of which exhibit fractal-like structure with increasing detail at smaller scales. And in all these cases, the measured value depends on the scale of measurement, and there is no single correct answer, only a family of answers indexed by measurement resolution. And this multiplicity is not an error or a limitation, but a feature of the geometry, a reflection of the fact that irregular shapes do not have simple scalar properties like length or area in the traditional sense. The mapmaker gives up, unable to provide a single definitive number for the coastline length, or provides multiple numbers with caveats about measurement scale, and the coastline stretches around the island, infinitely detailed, infinitely long if measured with infinite precision, and the paradox remains a reminder that geometry is more complex than Euclid imagined, that natural shapes do not conform to circles and straight lines, that measurement depends on scale, and that some questions like how long is the coastline do not have simple answers, and Mandelbrot's fractals provide a framework for understanding this complexity, for describing and quantifying irregular shapes, and for recognizing that the world is full of structures that are neither one-dimensional nor two-dimensional, but somewhere in between. And the paradox endures, a touchstone in fractal geometry, a demonstration that infinity appears not just in abstract mathematics, but in concrete measurements of real physical objects, and the coastline remains, jagged and intricate, defying simple measurement, a natural fractal that reveals the limits of traditional geometry and the need for new mathematical tools to capture the complexity of the world. The diamond water paradox: why necessities are cheap and luxuries expensive. An economist observes that water is essential for life, is necessary for survival, is the most useful substance, and yet water is cheap, is almost free, costs nearly nothing in most places, while diamonds are useless for survival, are decorative luxuries, serve no biological function, and yet diamonds are expensive, cost fortunes, are among the most valuable commodities. And this seems paradoxical, seems to contradict the principle that value should reflect usefulness, that prices should correspond to importance. And this is the diamond water paradox, first discussed by Adam Smith, a puzzle about why necessities are cheap and luxuries expensive, why things essential for life have low prices while things irrelevant to survival have high prices. And the paradox challenged early economic thinking, challenged the labour theory of value, which said that prices reflect the amount of labour required to produce goods, and the paradox remained unresolved until marginal utility theory was developed, until economists realized that value depends not on total utility, but on marginal utility, not on the usefulness of the entire quantity available, but on the usefulness of one additional unit. And water has high total utility. Life depends on it, but low marginal utility because we have abundant water, and one more gallon provides little additional benefit, while diamonds have low total utility but high marginal utility because diamonds are scarce, and one more diamond provides significant additional satisfaction to those who value them. And this insight resolved the paradox, showed that prices reflect scarcity and marginal benefit rather than total importance. And the diamond water paradox became a teaching example, became the canonical illustration of the difference between total and marginal value. Imagine your situation regarding water. You have access to abundant water, can drink whenever you want, can shower, can water plants, and the first glass of water each day is enormously valuable. Prevents dehydration, sustains life, but by the time you've consumed several gallons, the marginal value of additional water is nearly zero. Additional water provides almost no benefit, and since price reflects the value of the marginal unit, the value of one more gallon, and since that marginal value is nearly zero, price is nearly zero, is very low, and this explains why water is cheap despite being essential. Because the marginal unit is not very valuable, because we have so much water that additional water is worth little. And now consider diamonds. You probably have no diamonds or very few, and the first diamond you acquire has significant value, provides aesthetic pleasure, provides status, and since diamonds are scarce, since you have few or none, the marginal value of an additional diamond is high. And since price reflects marginal value, price is high. And this explains why diamonds are expensive despite being non-essential. Because the marginal unit is very valuable. Because diamonds are scarce and additional, diamonds provide significant benefit to those who value them. The diamond water paradox demonstrates the importance of distinguishing total utility from marginal utility, shows that these can diverge dramatically, that goods with high total utility can have low marginal utility, and vice versa. And this distinction is fundamental to microeconomics, is the basis for understanding consumer choice, for deriving demand curves, for analysing how people allocate scarce resources, and marginal thinking, thinking about the value of additional units rather than the value of entire categories, is essential for economic reasoning. And the paradox illustrates why marginal thinking matters, why it produces different conclusions than total thinking, and resolving the paradox required economists to shift from thinking about total value to thinking about marginal value, to recognise that prices are determined at the margin, by the last unit exchanged, not by the average or total units. Visualise the marginal utility curves for water and diamonds. The marginal utility of water is high for the first units, the first gallons that prevent dehydration, but declines rapidly as consumption increases, as basic needs are satisfied, and at the quantity consumed, the marginal utility is low, is near zero, and price equals this low marginal utility, while the marginal utility of diamonds is high even at low quantities, because diamonds are scarce, because even wealthy people have relatively few diamonds. And at the quantity consumed, the marginal utility remains high, and price equals this high marginal utility. And this graphical representation makes the resolution clear, makes it visible that prices reflect marginal, not total utility, and the paradox dissolves once the distinction is understood. One implication of the diamond water paradox is about consumer surplus, the difference between what consumers would be willing to pay for all units and what they actually pay. And consumer surplus for water is enormous, is the difference between the life-saving value of the first units and the near-zero price paid, and consumers gain vastly more from water than they pay for it. While consumer surplus for diamonds is small, buyers pay prices close to their willingness to pay, and this shows that market prices do not reflect total value to consumers, do not capture the full benefit people receive, and the difference is consumer surplus is the unmeasured benefit. And understanding this helps explain why markets are beneficial, why trade creates value, because both buyers and sellers typically gain surplus, gain benefit beyond what they pay or receive. Another implication concerns necessity goods and luxury goods more generally. The paradox illustrates that necessities tend to be cheap, tend to have low prices relative to their importance, because necessities are typically abundant or because demand saturates quickly, because once basic needs are satisfied, marginal utility declines, while luxuries tend to be expensive, tend to have high prices relative to their importance, because luxuries are scarce or because demand does not saturate, because the wealthy always want more luxuries, and this pattern has implications for taxation. For understanding that taxing necessities is regressive, hits the poor harder, while taxing luxuries is progressive, hits the wealthy harder, and the paradox helps explain why economists typically advocate luxury taxes over necessity taxes, why sin taxes on non-essential goods are more acceptable than food taxes. The paradox also appears in discussions about water scarcity because the resolution depends on water being abundant, depends on marginal utility being low, but in regions where water is scarce, the marginal utility of water rises dramatically, and prices should rise correspondingly, should reflect scarcity. And this suggests that in water-scarce regions, water should be expensive, should be priced to encourage conservation, to allocate scarce supplies efficiently, but such pricing is controversial, is seen as making a necessity unaffordable. And this creates political tension, creates conflict between economic efficiency, which requires high prices for scarce water, and social justice, which requires affordable water, and resolving this tension requires subsidies or tiered pricing or other interventions. And the paradox illuminates the trade-offs involved. Some argue that the diamond water paradox is not fully resolved, that even marginal utility theory leaves puzzles because why do diamonds have high marginal utility? Why do people value diamonds? And the answer involves signaling, involves conspicuous consumption, involves diamonds serving as status symbols. And this is a different kind of value, is social rather than intrinsic. And understanding diamond value requires understanding social dynamics, understanding how luxuries signal wealth, how scarcity creates desirability, and this extends the resolution, shows that marginal utility can reflect social as well as physical properties, can reflect symbolic meaning as well as functional use. The paradox also connects to debates about labor theory of value, because Marx used labor theory, argued that value reflects socially necessary labor time, and the diamond water paradox is often seen as refuting labor theory, as showing that prices do not simply reflect labor inputs, because water requires little labor per gallon, but is essential, while diamonds require more labor but are luxury. But defenders of labor theory respond that the paradox misunderstands their theory, that labor theory concerns exchange value, not use value, concerns prices, not total utility, and that labor theory can accommodate the paradox by recognizing that scarcity affects prices, that supply and demand matter, and this debate continues, shows that the paradox remains relevant for understanding competing theories of value. Water flows abundantly, is drunk freely, costs almost nothing, and diamonds sit in vaults, are purchased rarely, cost fortunes, and the paradox stands: necessity is cheap and luxury expensive. Total utility diverges from price, and the resolution comes through marginal thinking, through recognizing that prices reflect the value of additional units, not the value of all units, through understanding that scarcity matters, that abundance reduces marginal value, and the diamond water paradox endures as one of the classic examples in economics, as the teaching tool for introducing marginal utility, as the illustration of why economic thinking requires focusing on the margin, on incremental changes, on additional units, and the paradox remains, resolved but instructive, showing that value is context-dependent, is determined by scarcity and marginal benefit, and prices reflect the margin, not the total, and understanding this is fundamental to economic reasoning. The Bell spaceship paradox. When two rockets pull a string apart, two identical spaceships float in space, separated by some distance, let us say 1 kilometer measured in their initial rest frame, and a thin thread connects the two ships, stretched taut but not under tension, and now both ships fire their rockets simultaneously, both accelerating at exactly the same rate, both reaching the same velocity at the same time as measured in the original rest frame. And the question arises, what happens to the thread? Does it break or does it remain intact? And the paradox is that two different lines of reasoning seem to give opposite answers. One argument says the thread remains intact because both ships accelerate identically and maintain constant separation in the original rest frame, while another argument says the thread must break because of length contraction, and this is Bell's spaceship paradox, proposed by physicist John Stuart Bell to clarify misconceptions about special relativity and the nature of length contraction. Consider the first argument. In the original rest frame, both ships start 1 kilometer apart, and both ships accelerate at the same rate, their velocities remaining equal at all times, and so the distance between them, as measured in the original rest frame, remains 1 kilometer throughout the acceleration. The ships maintain constant separation as measured by rulers at rest in the original frame, and the thread, stretched between the ships, also spans 1 kilometer in this frame. And if the separation does not change, then why would the thread break? It experiences no increased tension, no stretching, and so the thread should remain intact. And this reasoning seems compelling, seems to follow directly from the symmetry of the situation. But now consider the second argument, from the perspective of someone accelerating with the ships, someone in the instantaneous rest frame of the spaceships at any given moment. And in this frame, the distance between the ships is undergoing length contraction relative to the original frame. The proper distance between the ships, the distance measured by a ruler moving with the ships, is greater than 1 kilometer and growing because the ships are maintaining constant coordinate separation in the original frame, while length contraction says that moving objects are contracted, and so to maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame, the proper separation must increase, must stretch, and the thread, a physical object with a rest length, cannot stretch indefinitely without breaking, and so the thread must snap as the proper distance between the ships increases beyond the thread's breaking point. Bell's answer, and the correct answer according to relativity, is that the thread breaks. The second argument is correct, and the error in the first argument is subtle. It confuses coordinate distance in the original rest frame with proper distance measured by moving rulers. And length contraction does not mean that objects physically shrink in their own rest frame. It means that the relationship between coordinate distance in one frame and proper distance in another frame involves a contraction factor, and when two ships maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame while accelerating, they are actually increasing their proper separation, the distance measured by rulers that move with them, and the thread, stretched between the ships, experiences this increasing proper separation as tension, and eventually the tension exceeds the thread's strength and it breaks. Imagine the situation more concretely. Place a series of markers at rest in the original frame, spaced 1 meter apart, stretching from the first ship to the second ship. And initially, there are 1,000 markers spanning the 1 kilometer between the ships. And now, the ships accelerate, and at any given instant in the original frame, the ships remain at the same markers they started at. The distance between them measured by these markers remains 1,000 meters, but from the perspective of the moving ships, the markers are getting closer together, are contracting, because the markers are in motion relative to the ships, and so the ships see more and more markers passing between them. The number of markers spanning the gap increases, and this means the proper distance between the ships is increasing, and the thread, which has a fixed rest length, cannot span this increasing proper distance, and it breaks. The paradox reveals a common misconception about special relativity. The idea that if two objects start with a certain separation and undergo identical accelerations, then they must maintain the same separation. But this is false. Maintaining the same coordinate separation in one frame requires increasing proper separation when the objects are accelerating. And this is because acceleration is not relative in the way velocity is. Accelerating objects experience forces, have proper accelerations that can be measured by accelerometers on board, and two spaceships with identical proper accelerations do not maintain constant proper separation. They drift apart in their own instantaneous rest frames. Bell used this paradox to clarify that length contraction is a real physical effect, not merely a coordinate artifact or an optical illusion. The thread really breaks. Real physical forces are involved, and the contraction of moving objects is a consequence of how electromagnetic forces between atoms transform under Lorentz boosts. And these forces are what hold matter together, what give objects their rigidity, and when objects accelerate, the forces adjust. And in the Bell spaceship scenario, the adjustment causes the thread to experience tension and eventually to snap. The paradox also connects to the Ehrenfest paradox, another puzzle in special relativity involving rotation and length contraction, where a disk spinning at relativistic speeds seems to have a contracted circumference but unchanged radius, leading to apparent contradictions with Euclidean geometry. And both paradoxes illustrate that accelerated motion introduces subtleties that are not present in inertial motion, that naive applications of length contraction can lead to errors, and that careful analysis using the full machinery of special relativity is required to get the right answers. Visualize the two spaceships accelerating in lockstep, their separation constant as measured by observers at rest, but the thread between them stretching from the ship's perspective, growing taut, fibers straining and eventually snapping, breaking in the middle, the two halves trailing behind each ship, and the observers at rest see the thread break. Even though the ships never changed their coordinate separation, and this breaking is real, is frame independent, all observers agree that the thread broke. Though they may disagree about why, about what forces were involved, but the physical fact of the breaking is invariant, is an event in spacetime that everyone can observe. Bell's spaceship paradox remains a challenging problem in relativity pedagogy. Many students, and even some physicists, initially get it wrong, arguing that the thread should not break, and the paradox serves as a test of whether someone truly understands length contraction and the relativity of simultaneity, whether they can correctly apply these concepts to accelerating objects. And the paradox has generated extensive discussion in physics journals, with papers clarifying the resolution and exploring variations. And it stands as a reminder that special relativity, despite being over a century old, still contains subtleties that require careful thought, that intuitions about space and time must be constantly checked against the formalism, and that even seemingly simple scenarios can hide deep complexities. The rockets fire, the ships accelerate, maintaining constant spacing in the original frame, and the thread stretches, taut and straining, and then snaps, unable to bridge the growing proper distance. And Bell's paradox resolves, the thread breaks, relativity vindicated, and the lesson learned, that acceleration changes things, that maintaining coordinate separation requires increasing proper separation, that length contraction is real and physical, and that relativity continues to surprise, continues to challenge intuition, continues to reward careful analysis with deeper understanding of how space and time and motion interweave to create the strange but consistent fabric of relativistic physics. The Abilene Paradox: Why Groups Choose What Nobody Wants. A family sits on a porch in Coleman, Texas, on a hot afternoon, comfortable, playing dominoes, and the father-in-law suggests driving to Abilene for dinner, 53 miles away in a car without air conditioning. And the suggestion is not enthusiastic, is tentative, but the son-in-law says sure, sounds good. Not because he wants to go, but because he assumes others want to go, and he wants to be agreeable. And the wife says yes if you all want to go, and the mother-in-law says of course, and they all pile into the car and drive to Abilene in dusty heat, arrive hot and tired, eat mediocre food, drive back exhausted, and sitting on the porch again, someone admits they didn't really want to go, and then everyone admits they didn't want to go, admits they only agreed because they thought others wanted it. And the entire group took an action that no individual wanted, chose an outcome that everyone preferred to avoid. And this is the Abilene paradox, described by management professor Jerry Harvey, a phenomenon where groups make decisions that contradict the preferences of all members, where collective action diverges from individual preferences, not through majority rule or compromise, but through misperception, through failure to communicate, through assumptions about what others want. And the paradox reveals that agreement is not always consensus, that unanimous decisions can be unwanted by everyone. And the Abilene paradox shows a different kind of collective irrationality from Condorcet cycles or voting paradoxes. Shows irrationality that arises from social dynamics, from conformity pressure, from reluctance to dissent. And the paradox remains relevant for understanding group decision-making, for recognizing that groups can fail not just through conflict, but through false consensus, through everyone going along with what nobody wants. Imagine the psychology of each family member. Each sits on the porch comfortable, each prefers staying home, but each hears the suggestion and thinks, well, if someone is suggesting it, they must want it. I don't want to be the one who ruins everyone's plans. I should be agreeable, go along, be a team player. And so each agrees despite preferring to stay, and no one voices their actual preference. No one says I'd rather stay home. And the group collectively creates a false impression, creates the appearance of consensus when none exists, and everyone interprets others' agreement as reflecting genuine preference rather than social accommodation. And this mutual misperception drives the group toward an outcome no one wants. And the paradox unfolds. The trip is taken, the unwanted dinner eaten, and only afterward does truth emerge. Does communication clarify that everyone preferred staying home? And the group confronts the absurdity, the recognition that they did something no one wanted through failure to communicate authentically. The Abilene paradox differs from groupthink, where group members genuinely conform their preferences to the group, genuinely come to believe the group view. And Abilene involves no genuine preference change, involves only misperception, only assumption about what others want. And members maintain their private preferences, but suppress them out of social pressure, out of desire to be agreeable. And this suppression is the source of the paradox, creates the gap between public agreement and private preference, and the gap allows groups to pursue actions that everyone opposes. And breaking the paradox requires someone to voice dissent, to say, actually, I'd prefer not to go. And this dissent can reveal that others feel the same, can break the false consensus, but dissent is risky, is socially uncomfortable, requires challenging what appears to be group preference. And most people avoid this, prefer to go along, and the paradox persists. Visualize the Abilene paradox as a coordination failure, where the optimal outcome requires everyone to reveal their true preferences, requires honest communication, but social norms and psychological tendencies prevent this, create pressure toward agreement, toward accommodation, toward not rocking the boat. And these pressures are strongest when relationships matter, when group harmony is valued, when dissent risks social costs and family dinners and work teams and community groups all face Abilene risks. All can make decisions that no one wants, through false consensus, through failure to communicate authentically. And the paradox shows that agreement is not always good, that unanimous decisions can be wrong, that groups need mechanisms for authentic communication, need cultures that encourage dissent, need permission to disagree. One lesson from the Abilene paradox is the importance of honest communication, of creating environments where people feel safe expressing disagreement, where dissent is welcomed rather than punished. And organizations that suffer repeated Abilene paradoxes often have cultures of false harmony, have norms that discourage challenging proposals, have leaders who interpret dissent as disloyalty, and these cultures create conditions for Abilene, create pressure toward agreement, and preventing the paradox requires changing culture, requires valuing truth over harmony, requires encouraging people to voice concerns. And this is difficult, requires conscious effort, requires leadership that models disagreement, that rewards dissent, that avoids shooting messengers. Another lesson is about decision-making procedures, about how groups can avoid Abilene through structured processes, through anonymous voting, through devil's advocate roles, through explicit checking for consensus, through asking not just who agrees, but who disagrees and why. And these procedures create space for dissent, create permission to voice opposition, and reduce pressure toward false consensus. And effective groups use these procedures systematically, build them into decision-making, recognize that surface agreement may hide opposition, and these procedures are especially important for high-stakes decisions, for commitments that are costly to reverse. And the trip to Abilene is costly, is unpleasant for everyone, and could have been avoided with better communication. The Abilene paradox also appears in organizational settings, in corporations where teams pursue strategies that no one really supports, in committees that adopt policies no member wants, in groups that invest in projects everyone privately doubts. And these organizational Abilenes are costly, waste resources, damage morale, produce outcomes that serve no one's interests. And preventing them requires organizational awareness, requires training people to recognize Abilene dynamics, requires creating cultures where speaking up is safe, where dissent is valued, and many organizations fail at this. Have cultures of deference, have hierarchies, where subordinates agree with superiors even when privately opposed. And these cultures are Abilene-prone, create repeated paradoxes, and organizational effectiveness requires breaking these patterns. Some argue that the Abilene paradox is overstated, that genuine cases are rare, that most group decisions reflect genuine preferences of at least some members, and while everyone agreeing despite everyone opposing is uncommon, partial Abilene is more common, where some members oppose but remain silent, and the group pursues a course that a vocal minority supports while a silent majority opposes, and this partial Abilene is still problematic, still produces suboptimal outcomes, and preventing it still requires encouraging dissent, requires creating safety for opposition. The paradox also raises questions about responsibility, about who is responsible when groups make decisions no one wants. And the answer is everyone and no one. Everyone contributed through silence, through false agreement, through failure to voice opposition, but no one individually caused the outcome. No one individually chose wrongly. Each made a reasonable social decision to accommodate perceived group preferences. And the collective outcome is worse than any individual action merited. And this shows how social dynamics can produce results that exceed individual culpability, can create group failures that no individual intended. And avoiding such failures requires collective awareness, requires group-level solutions, requires changing communication patterns and decision procedures. The family sits on the porch afterward, hot and tired and annoyed, and someone admits they didn't want to go, and the admissions cascade. And everyone realizes the absurdity, realizes they collectively did something no one wanted, and the Abilene paradox is revealed, and laughter mixes with frustration, and the lesson is learned. The importance of honest communication, the danger of false consensus, the need to voice dissent, and the paradox remains a permanent reminder that groups can fail not just through conflict, but through excessive agreeableness, through mistaken assumptions about others' preferences, through social pressures that suppress authentic communication, and the Abilene paradox endures as a cautionary tale about group decision-making, a demonstration that agreement is not always consensus, that unanimous decisions can be wrong, and that preventing collective irrationality requires creating environments where dissent is safe, where truth is valued over harmony, and where groups communicate authentically rather than accommodating falsely. Synesthesia. Paradox: why numbers have colours and sounds have tastes. A person looks at the number 5 and sees it as blue, not imagines it as blue, not associates it with blue, but actually sees blue, experiences colour as an intrinsic property of the number. And another person hears music and tastes chocolate, hears certain chords, and the taste appears involuntarily, automatically. And these experiences are synesthesia, are cross-modal sensory experiences where stimulation in one modality produces perception in another. And synesthesia is not metaphor, is not learned association, is a genuine perceptual phenomenon experienced by roughly 4% of the population. And the paradox is that synesthetes experience properties that are not physically present, see colours that are not in the stimulus, taste flavours that have no source, and yet these experiences are consistent, are reliable. The same numbers always evoke the same colours, the same sounds always evoke the same tastes, and this reliability distinguishes synesthesia from imagination or association, shows that synesthesia is automatic, is perceptual rather than cognitive, and the phenomenon reveals something fundamental about how the brain is organised, shows that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, but can communicate, can influence each other, and synesthesia represents an extreme of this cross-modal interaction, represents a neural architecture where connections between sensory areas are stronger than normal, are sufficient to produce conscious experiences in one modality when another is stimulated. Imagine being a grapheme colour synesthete, the most common form where letters and numbers evoke colours, and you read this text and every letter has its own colour. A is red, B is green, C is yellow, and the colours are vivid, are as clear as real colours, are not vague or imagined but are perceptually present. And when you see the letter A, you cannot help but see red. The colour is automatic, is triggered by the visual form of the letter, and this colouring happens for all letters and numbers, creates a richly coloured experience of reading. And while this might sound beautiful, it can also be distracting, can interfere with reading when the printed colours conflict with synesthetic colours, can create confusion. And yet for synesthetes, this is normal, is how the world has always looked. And they are often surprised to learn that others do not experience letters as coloured, that the colours are unique to synesthetes. Synesthesia demonstrates that perception is not modular, is not strictly segregated by sensory modality, and in synesthetes there is cross-activation. There are connections between sensory areas that do not exist or are weaker in non-synesthetes, and these connections allow activity in one area to trigger activity in another. And when grapheme area, the region that processes letter and number shapes, is activated, it also activates colour area, the region that processes colour, and this cross-activation produces the experience of coloured letters. And neuroimaging studies have confirmed this, have shown that when synesthetes see numbers, colour areas of visual cortex are activated, are lit up, and this activation is automatic, is bottom-up, is not produced by conscious thought or imagination, but is triggered by the stimulus itself. Visualize the brain as having sensory areas that are normally separate: visual area, auditory area, taste area, and these areas process their respective inputs and pass information to higher level regions. But in synesthetes there are additional connections. There are pathways between sensory areas that allow direct crosstalk, and these pathways are the neural basis of synesthesia, are what allows stimulation in one modality to produce experiences in another. And the connections are not learned, are not created through experience, but are developmental, are present from early life. And synesthesia is lifelong, is consistent. The same cross-modal experiences occurring throughout the synesthete's life. The synesthesia paradox is that these experiences are perceptual, are as real as any other perception, and yet the properties perceived are not present in the stimulus. The number 5 is not blue, is black on white, and yet the synesthete sees blue. And this challenges theories that say perception is veridical, is accurate, is a representation of physical reality. And synesthesia shows that perception can include properties that are not in the world, that are generated internally, and yet these properties feel external, feel like properties of objects rather than like internal mental states. And this raises questions about the nature of perception, about what it means for perception to be of something, about whether all perception involves some degree of construction, some degree of adding properties that are not in the stimulus. One theory of synesthesia is that everyone is born with extensive cross-modal connections, that infant brains have connections between all sensory areas, and during development, most of these connections are pruned or eliminated, and sensory areas become more segregated. And in synesthetes, some of these early connections are preserved, are not pruned, and this preservation allows the cross-modal experiences to continue into adulthood. And this theory is supported by evidence that infants show some synesthetic effects, show cross-modal correspondences, and that synesthesia runs in families, has a genetic component, suggesting that genes that regulate synaptic pruning are involved. Another theory is that synesthesia involves disinhibition, involves normally present connections between sensory areas that are usually inhibited, are suppressed, and in synesthetes this inhibition is weakened, is less effective, and so the connections are active, allow cross-activation, and this theory is supported by evidence that synesthesia can be induced temporarily in non-synesthetes through drugs that reduce inhibition, through hypnosis, through sensory deprivation, suggesting that the neural machinery for synesthesia is present in everyone, but is normally inhibited, and synesthetes have less inhibition, have more open channels between sensory areas. Synesthesia also has practical implications. Some synesthetes report that their experiences are useful, provide memory aids, make information more distinctive, easier to remember, and some musicians with sound colour synesthesia report that the colours help with composition, with understanding musical structure, and some artists deliberately cultivate synesthetic experiences, use them as sources of creativity. And understanding synesthesia has implications for education, for recognising that people process information differently, that sensory experiences vary across individuals, and that teaching should accommodate these differences, should recognise that some students have richly coloured experiences of letters and numbers, while others do not. The phenomenon also raises questions about consciousness, about qualia, about the subjective properties of experience, because synesthetes have different qualia than non-synesthetes, have colour experiences that others do not, and this shows that consciousness is not uniform, is not the same across individuals, and qualia vary, and this variation is not just quantitative, is not just more or less of the same experience, but is qualitative, involves entirely different types of experience, and this challenges theories that say consciousness is universal, is the same for everyone, and supports theories that say consciousness is individual, is constructed by each brain in potentially different ways. And synesthesia is one example of this variation, is one way that consciousness can differ. Some philosophers argue that synesthesia shows that perception is not representational, does not represent external properties, because the colours seen by graphema colour synesthetes do not represent anything in the world. The number 5 is not blue, and yet the colour is perceived, and this challenges representational theories of perception, suggests that perceptual experiences are not always representations of external properties but can be internally generated responses. And synesthesia is a case where the response includes properties that are not being represented, and this raises questions about what makes perception representational, whether all aspects of perception are representations or whether some are merely responses are produced by the perceptual system without representing anything external. The number appears black on white, and the synesthete sees blue, vivid, and automatic. The colour is as real as the number, is as perceptually present, and yet the colour is not there, is not in the stimulus, is generated by the brain, is a cross-modal activation, and the synesthesia paradox remains. Perception includes non-veridical properties, includes experiences that do not correspond to stimulus properties, and yet these experiences are automatic, are reliable, are as perceptually real as any other, and synesthesia endures as one of the most fascinating phenomena in neuroscience. A demonstration that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, that cross-modal connections exist, that perception can include internally generated properties, and that consciousness varies across individuals, includes experiences that are unique, that are not shared by everyone, and the colours remain overlaid on letters, triggered by sounds, evoked by tastes, and the cross-modal world of synesthetes continues, different from the world non-synesthetes perceive, richer in some ways, more confusing in others, and the phenomenon persists. Quine's Gavagai problem? Why we can never know what anyone really means. An anthropologist arrives in a remote village to study an unknown language, a language no outsider has encountered before. And the anthropologist has no translator, no dictionary, no common linguistic framework, only observations and patience, and the method is radical translation. Learning the language from scratch by observing how natives use words in response to events. And one day, a rabbit runs past and a native points and says Gavagai, and the anthropologist writes in the notebook, Gavagai means rabbit. And this seems reasonable, seems like an obvious inference. The native saw a rabbit and said Gavagai, so Gavagai must refer to rabbits. But philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine points out a problem, a deep problem about meaning and translation. Because Gavagai might mean rabbit, but it might also mean undetached rabbit part, or rabbit stage, or collection of rabbit molecules, or instance of rabbithood. And all these translations are consistent with the native's behaviour. All would lead the native to say Gavagai in exactly the same circumstances, whenever a rabbit is present, and there is no fact of the matter, no objective truth about which translation is correct, no way to determine what Gavagai really means. And this indeterminacy is not due to practical limitations, not due to insufficient evidence, but is fundamental, is a consequence of how meaning works. And this is Quine's Gavagai problem, also called the problem of indeterminacy of translation, a challenge to the idea that words have determinate meanings, that translation has right answers, and that we can know what others mean when they speak. Imagine trying to distinguish between Gavagai means rabbit and Gavagai means undetached rabbit part. And you point to the rabbit and the native says Gavagai, and you point to the rabbit's ear and ask whether this is Gavagai, and the native responds, but you do not know whether the response means yes because the ear is an undetached rabbit part, or no, because the ear is not a whole rabbit, or something else entirely. And every test you design, every question you ask, can be interpreted in multiple ways, can be answered consistently by multiple translations, and no amount of observation, no behavioural evidence can definitively settle which translation is correct, because the native's behaviour under all possible circumstances is compatible with multiple interpretations. And Quine argues that this shows meaning is indeterminate, that there is no fact about what Gavagai really means, only different translation manuals that work equally well, that map the native's language onto ours in different but equally legitimate ways. The problem generalizes beyond anthropology to all understanding of language, because even when we share a language, even when we both speak English, the Gavagai problem applies, We cannot be certain that we mean the same thing by our words, that rabbit means to you what it means to me. We might be using different concepts, carved up differently, but our behaviour is similar enough that we never notice the difference. And this raises the disturbing possibility that communication is always partial, always approximate, that we never fully understand each other, that meaning is not something objective that words have, but something we impose through interpretation, and different interpretations can fit the evidence equally well, and there is no transcendent perspective from which to judge which interpretation is correct. Visualize meaning as a relationship between words and world, and Quine's point is that this relationship is underdetermined by behaviour, by the evidence available to translators, because infinitely many relationships are consistent with the same behavioural evidence. Infinitely many ways of mapping words to world produce the same observable patterns. And choosing among these possibilities requires going beyond evidence, requires making decisions that are not forced by facts. And these decisions constitute meaning rather than discovering it. And so meaning is partially conventional, partially stipulated, not fully determined by reality. The Gavagai problem challenges referential theories of meaning, theories that say words mean things because they refer to objects in the world, because rabbit refers to rabbits, and water refers to water, and Quine's argument shows that reference is inscrutable, cannot be determined from behaviour alone, because words can be interpreted as referring to different things, different ways of carving up reality, and all interpretations fit the evidence, and so reference is not an objective relation, but is relative to a translation manual, relative to a scheme of interpretation, and different manuals. Different schemes can assign different references to the same words while remaining equally correct. One response to the Gavagai problem accepts the indeterminacy, embraces it as a truth about meaning, argues that Quine is right, that there is no fact of the matter about what words mean beyond what is determined by behavioural evidence, and meaning is holistic, depends on the entire network of beliefs and language practices. And translation manuals are theoretical frameworks that organise this evidence. And like all theories, they are underdetermined by data, and multiple theories fit the same data equally well. And choosing among them involves pragmatic considerations, simplicity, utility, coherence, but not truth in any absolute sense. And this response treats meaning as a human construction, something we create through practices rather than something we discover in nature. Another response denies the indeterminacy, argues that Quine's thought experiment is artificial, that in real translation situations additional evidence is available, evidence about intentions, about how speakers correct each other, about the structure of their conceptual schemes. And this additional evidence narrows down the possibilities, rules out bizarre interpretations like undetached rabbit part, and determines that Gavagai means rabbit in the ordinary sense. And while perfect certainty may be impossible, practical determinacy is achievable, and meaning is objective enough for communication to succeed, for translation to have right and wrong answers. And the Gavagai problem is an epistemological worry, a concern about how we know what words mean, but it does not show that words lack determinate meanings, only that discovering those meanings is difficult. A third response appeals to charity, to the principle that we should interpret speakers as making sense, as having coherent beliefs, as speaking truly most of the time, and this principle constrains translation, rules out interpretations that make speakers irrational or massively mistaken. And while charity does not uniquely determine translation, it narrows the range of acceptable interpretations, and combined with simplicity and other pragmatic virtues, it makes translation tractable, makes it possible to arrive at good translations, even if not perfect ones. And this response treats translation as an interpretive practice, guided by norms rather than as a purely empirical investigation, guided only by behaviour. The Gavagai problem also connects to broader philosophical issues about realism and anti-realism, about whether there are objective facts independent of our theories and languages. Because if meaning is indeterminate, then perhaps reality itself is indeterminate. Perhaps there is no fact about whether rabbits or undetached rabbit parts exist, only different ways of organizing experience, different conceptual schemes that carve up the world differently. And Quine's ontological relativity, his claim that what objects exist is relative to a language or theory, follows from the Gavagai problem, from the recognition that reference is inscrutable, that we cannot say what exists absolutely, but only what exists relative to a framework. The anthropologist sits with a notebook, the word Gavagai recorded, the translation uncertain, and the native speaks, and the anthropologist interprets, and communication proceeds approximately, pragmatically, successfully enough for practical purposes, and whether Gavagai really means rabbit or something else remains undetermined, remains a question without an answer, and Quine's problem persists, not as a practical obstacle to translation, but as a philosophical challenge to theories of meaning, as a demonstration that meaning is more elusive than we thought, more dependent on interpretation and less determined by facts. And the Gavagai problem endures as one of Quine's most influential contributions, a thought experiment that changed how philosophers think about language, about meaning, about translation, and about the relationship between words and world. And the problem remains unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, a permanent feature of linguistic philosophy, a reminder that understanding each other is harder than it seems, that meaning is indeterminate, that communication is an achievement rather than an automatic consequence of shared language, and that the gap between what we say and what we mean, between our words and their reference, can never be fully closed. And the rabbit runs past and the native says, Gavagai, and we translate approximately, hopefully, never quite certain that we have understood. Parfit's teletransportation paradox. Imagine a future where technology allows instant travel across vast distances through a process called teletransportation. A device scans your body down to the atomic level, recording the exact position and state of every particle, and then transmits this information to a distant location where another device reconstructs you perfectly, assembling a body atom by atom according to the transmitted blueprint. And the reconstruction is flawless, every memory intact, every scar reproduced, every thought continued, and the reconstructed person steps out of the receiving chamber, believing themselves to be you, feeling no discontinuity, no sense that anything strange has occurred. The philosopher Derek Parfit asked a disturbing question about this process. Are you the person who steps out of the receiving chamber, or did you die in the scanning chamber? And a copy, a duplicate with all your memories and personality, is now living your life. And if the scanning process destroys the original body as it records the information, then perhaps it is still you, continuous in some sense, but what if the original body is not destroyed? What if the scanner leaves you standing in the departure chamber, intact and alive, while the reconstruction appears in the receiving chamber? And now there are two of you, both with equal claim to being the original, both feeling that they are you, and if both are you, then identity has become plural. But if only one is you, then which one and what criterion could possibly distinguish them when they are physically and psychologically identical? Parfit used this thought experiment to challenge the intuition that personal identity is what matters in survival, arguing that what matters is not identity, not being numerically the same person, but rather psychological continuity and connectedness, the preservation of memories, personality, beliefs, desires, and ongoing projects. And if these are preserved, then survival has occurred even if strict identity has not. And so, the reconstructed person is you in every way that matters, even if they are not numerically identical to the original you. And the question of whether identity is preserved is a question about what we care about rather than a deep metaphysical fact. The paradox becomes more troubling when variations are introduced. Suppose the teletransportation device malfunctions and creates not one, but two reconstructions. Both perfect, both claiming to be you, and now identity must branch. Which seems impossible because identity is supposed to be a one-to-one relation. A thing is identical only to itself, and yet both reconstructions have an equal claim. And if identity is not preserved in this case, then why should it be preserved in the normal case where only one reconstruction appears? And if it is not preserved, then every time you use the teletransporter, you die, and a new person with your memories takes your place, living a life they falsely believe is a continuation of yours. Parfit embraced the conclusion that identity is not what matters, that we should care about psychological continuity rather than numerical identity, and that the concept of a persisting self, a single unified person who endures over time, is less important than we ordinarily think. That what makes your future self matter to you now is not that they are literally the same person, but that they are psychologically connected to you in the right ways, and if those connections can branch or spread across multiple individuals, then so be it. Identity is not sacred, not the ultimate ground of value or concern. The teletransportation paradox has implications for how we think about personal survival, about whether what matters in death is the cessation of psychological continuity or the cessation of biological life, about whether uploading consciousness to a computer or creating digital copies would constitute survival or merely the creation of simulacra, and about whether the self is a metaphysical entity or a convenient fiction we use to organize experience. The paradox also challenges intuitions about moral responsibility, because if identity is vague or plural, then questions about who is responsible for past actions or who deserves future rewards become murky, and the unity of the person, which underpins much of ethics and law, begins to dissolve. Parfit's teletransportation scenario remains one of the most powerful thought experiments in philosophy, a story that uses imaginable technology to expose deep questions about identity, survival, and what it means to be a person, forcing recognition that the boundaries of the self, like the boundaries of clouds and cats, may be far less clear and far less important than common sense suggests, and that the question of whether you survive. Teletransportation may have no determinate answer, or many answers, or may simply be the wrong question to ask. The Fermi paradox. Where is everybody in this crowded universe? The Milky Way galaxy contains hundreds of billions of stars, many with planets, and our galaxy is one of hundreds of billions of galaxies in the observable universe. And Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago, relatively late in cosmic history, and life emerged within 1 billion years, and intelligence and technology developed recently. And these facts suggest that Earth is not special, that the conditions that led to life here should occur elsewhere, and if even a tiny fraction of planets develop intelligent civilizations, and if even a small percentage of those civilizations develop technology capable of space travel or interstellar communication, then the galaxy should be teeming with evidence of alien intelligence. We should see their radio signals, their spacecraft, their structures, their influence on stars and planets, and yet we see nothing, hear nothing, find no evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence despite decades of searching, despite scanning the skies with radio telescopes, despite analysing thousands of exoplanets. And this silence, this absence of evidence, is the Fermi paradox, named after physicist Enrico Fermi, who reportedly asked during a lunch conversation in 1950, "Where is everybody?" And this question, simple and childlike, conceals one of the deepest puzzles in science, the question of whether we are alone in the universe, or whether alien civilizations exist but remain undetected for reasons we do not yet understand. The paradox can be stated more precisely through the Drake equation, an attempt to estimate the number of communicating civilizations in our galaxy. The equation multiplies together several factors. the rate of star formation, the fraction of stars with planets, the number of habitable planets per star system, the fraction of habitable planets where life emerges, the fraction of life-bearing planets where intelligence evolves, the fraction of intelligent species that develop technology, and the lifetime of technological civilizations. And depending on the values assigned to these factors, the equation predicts anywhere from 0 civilizations besides us to millions, and optimistic estimates suggest thousands or millions of alien civilizations should exist in our galaxy alone. And over billions of years, some of these civilizations should have spread through the galaxy, colonizing stars, building structures, leaving traces, and yet we see nothing. And this gap between expectation and observation is the Fermi paradox. Various explanations have been proposed, grouped into several categories. One possibility is that intelligent life is extraordinarily rare, that one or more factors in the Drake equation is much smaller than optimistic estimates suggest. Perhaps the emergence of life is a rare event. Perhaps the evolution of complex multicellular organisms requires unlikely coincidences. Perhaps intelligence is not an inevitable outcome of evolution, but a fluke that happened once on Earth and nowhere else. And if intelligence is sufficiently rare, then perhaps we are the first or among the first civilizations in the galaxy, and the silence is explained by our being early arrivals, alone for now, but perhaps not forever. Another category of explanations invokes the Great Filter, a hypothetical barrier that prevents civilizations from reaching the stage where they are detectable across interstellar distances. And the filter could be in our past, something that makes the emergence of intelligence extremely difficult, in which case humanity has passed the filter and the future is open, or the filter could be in our future, a challenge that civilizations face and almost always fail. Perhaps self-destruction through war or environmental collapse, perhaps technological stagnation, perhaps a transition that seems likely but proves fatal. And if the great filter lies ahead, then our survival is not guaranteed, and the silence of the cosmos is ominous, a warning that intelligence tends toward extinction. A third category suggests that civilizations exist but remain undetected for various reasons. Perhaps they communicate using technologies we have not discovered. Perhaps they deliberately hide to avoid contact with younger civilizations. Perhaps they exist in forms we would not recognize as life or intelligence. Perhaps they transcend physical form and migrate into cyberspace or other dimensions. Or perhaps the distances and timescales involved are so vast that civilizations exist but are separated by millions of light years and billions of years, arising and falling in isolation, never overlapping in space and time, and so contact is impossible. Not because civilizations do not exist, but because the universe is too big and time is too long. Visualize the galaxy as a vast ocean, and civilizations as islands, separated by light years of empty space, and each island has a brief window of technological activity, a few thousand years perhaps, before collapse or transformation, and the ocean is so large and the windows so brief that the probability of two civilizations existing simultaneously within communication range is vanishingly small. And so each civilization looks out, sees emptiness, hears silence, and concludes it is alone. And yet across the galaxy and across time many such civilizations exist, but they never meet, never communicate, never know each other, and the Fermi paradox is resolved not by the absence of life, but by the impossibility of contact. Another explanation, more speculative, suggests that we are living in a simulation, that the observable universe is a computational construct created by an advanced civilization and the silence is programmed. No other civilizations are simulated because the creators are interested only in studying us, or because simulating multiple civilizations is too computationally expensive. And this explanation, while unfalsifiable, is logically possible and provides a clean resolution to the paradox. though it raises new questions about the nature of the simulators and their purposes. The Fermi paradox has practical implications for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, for SETI programs that scan the skies for radio signals, for astrobiology missions that search for life on Mars or the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and for the question of whether humanity should attempt to contact alien civilizations or remain silent. Because if the great filter lies ahead, if civilizations typically self-destruct or face existential dangers, then advertising our presence might be risky, might attract attention from hostile or indifferent intelligences, and the silence of the cosmos might be a survival strategy, a lesson learned by civilizations that survive, and if so, then broadcasting our existence might be foolish, might mark us for extinction or exploitation. The paradox also touches on philosophy and the meaning of human existence, because if we are alone, if no other intelligence exists anywhere in the observable universe, then humanity carries a unique responsibility. We are the universe's only way of understanding itself, the only conscious observers, the only beings capable of science and art and love, and the future of consciousness depends on us, on whether we survive and spread. And this realization, far from being comforting, is terrifying, because it places an enormous burden on a species that has barely begun to leave its home planet. And if we fail, if we destroy ourselves, the universe returns to darkness, to unconsciousness, to a vast emptiness where stars burn and galaxies collide. But no one watches, no one cares, no one knows. The stars shine silent and distant, and we listen, and we hear nothing, and the silence stretches across billions of light years, across billions of years, and Fermi's question echoes, where is everybody? Where are the aliens? Where are the civilizations that should exist, that must exist, that the numbers say should exist, and the answer does not come? And the paradox remains unresolved, pressing, urgent, a question that haunts astronomers and philosophers, a mystery that drives the search for life beyond Earth, and a reminder that despite all our knowledge, despite all our telescopes and equations, we do not know whether we are alone or whether the universe teems with life. And the silence, profound and unbroken, waits, and we wonder and we search, and the paradox persists. The fat man variant, when pushing someone off a bridge, becomes murder. The runaway trolley races toward 5 people bound to the tracks, the same setup as before, but now there is no lever, no switch to pull, no way to divert the trolley onto another track, and you stand on a footbridge directly above the tracks, watching the trolley approach, and next to you stands a very large person, large enough and heavy enough that if they fell onto the tracks, their body would stop the trolley, would derail it or bring it to a halt, saving the 5 people below, but killing the large person instantly. And you could push this person, could place your hands on their back and shove them over the railing, and they would fall, and the trolley would stop, and 5 lives would be saved at the cost of 1. And the numbers are identical to the original trolley problem, 5 saved and 1 killed, but the method is different, and this difference makes most people recoil, makes them say no, I would not push, even though the consequence is the same as pulling the lever in the original case. And this asymmetry is the heart of the fat man variant, sometimes called the footbridge problem, a thought experiment that probes our moral intuitions about direct versus indirect harm, about using people as means versus affecting them as side effects, and about the limits of consequentialist reasoning. Imagine yourself on the bridge, the large person standing peacefully beside you, unaware of the danger below, and you know that pushing them will save 5 lives. The calculus is clear, 1 death versus 5 deaths, and if outcomes are all that matter, then pushing is required, is morally obligatory, is the obviously right choice. But your hands hesitate, your body resists, because pushing feels like murder, feels like killing, feels fundamentally wrong in a way that pulling a lever does not. And this feeling, this visceral moral reaction, reveals something about how we think about ethics, reveals that we distinguish between different ways of bringing about the same result, that the means matter, not just the ends, that how we save lives affects whether saving them is permissible. The distinction centers on intentionality and instrumentalization. In the original lever case pulling, the lever diverts the trolley, and the one person on the sidetrack dies as an unfortunate consequence. Their death is foreseen, but not intended. You are not trying to kill them. You are trying to redirect the trolley, and their presence on the track is almost incidental. If they were not there, the trolley would still be diverted and the 5 would still be saved, whereas in the fat man case, pushing the person is specifically intended to use their body as an obstruction. Their death is not a side effect, but the means by which the trolley is stopped. You are deliberately killing them to achieve your goal, and if by some miracle they survived the fall, the trolley would not be stopped and the 5 would not be saved. Their death is essential to your plan, is what you're aiming at. And this makes the act feel more like murder, more like treating a human being as a mere object, as a tool to be used and discarded. Kantian ethics formalizes this intuition through the principle that persons are ends in themselves and should never be treated merely as means. And pushing the large person treats them as a mere means, uses their body without their consent to achieve a goal, reduces them to an instrument. Whereas pulling the lever does not treat the one person on the sidetrack as a means. They are harmed as a side effect, but not used, not instrumentalized. And this distinction, Kantians argue, is morally crucial, marks the line between permissible and impermissible killing. And the fat man variant falls on the wrong side, is impermissible because it uses a person, violates their dignity, treats them as less than fully human. Consequentialists reject this reasoning, argue that the distinction between intended and foreseen harm is morally irrelevant, that what matters is the result. 5 lives saved and 1 life lost. And whether the one person is killed as a means or as a side effect makes no difference to the outcome, makes no difference to the people involved. The large person dies either way. The 5 people are saved either way, and refusing to push means accepting 5 deaths to avoid one, means valuing squeamishness or abstract principles over actual lives. And this seems absurd, seems like letting moral theory override common sense. And consequentialists argue that in extreme cases, in genuine life or death dilemmas, the right action is the one that minimizes harm, maximizes welfare, saves the most lives. And any principle that forbids this is flawed, is giving too much weight to feelings and not enough to results. Visualize the large person standing on the bridge. They have thoughts, feelings, plans, loved ones, a life with value and meaning. And you're contemplating ending that life, snuffing it out. Not in self-defense, not as punishment, but as a tool to save others. And this feels different from pulling a lever. Feels more intimate, more violent, more like hands-on killing. And psychological research confirms this. People report stronger emotional reactions to the footbridge scenario, stronger activation of brain regions associated with personal moral judgment. And this emotional response is not irrational or mere squeamishness, but reflects deep moral intuitions about personal agency, about the wrongness of directly causing harm to an individual, about the sanctity of bodily autonomy. The fat man variant also raises questions about consent and voluntariness, because the large person has not volunteered to be sacrificed, has not consented to being used as a trolley stopper, and using their body without permission violates autonomy, violates the principle that competent adults have the right to control what happens to their own bodies. And this is true even if using them would save lives, even if the overall outcome would be better, because respecting autonomy means allowing people to refuse to help. Even when helping would be beneficial, means recognizing that people are not resources to be allocated for the greater good, but individuals with rights, with the right to say no, with the right not to be sacrificed against their will. Some philosophers have proposed intermediate cases to test the boundaries. Suppose the large person is standing on a trapdoor, that you could open remotely, dropping them onto the tracks without physically touching them. Is this more like the lever case or more like the pushing case? Or suppose the large person is terminally ill and unconscious. Does this change the moral calculus? Does it make using them more permissible? Or suppose they have explicitly consented in advance to being used in such situations? Does consent eliminate the moral problem? And these variations probe the principles at stake. Try to isolate what exactly makes the pushing wrong, whether it is the direct causation, the physical contact, the lack of consent, the instrumentalization, or some combination. And different moral theories give different answers, diagnose the wrongness differently, and the variant becomes a tool for testing ethical theories, for exposing their commitments and seeing where they lead. The footbridge stands above the tracks. The large person breathes beside you unaware. The trolley approaches and the 5 people below are oblivious to their doom. And you must decide, push or do not push, kill or let die, violate one person's rights, or allow 5 people to perish. And there is no time for lengthy deliberation. No time to consult ethicists or calculate utilities. Only a choice that will haunt you regardless. Because pushing means you killed someone, placed your hands on them, and ended their life. And not pushing means 5 people died who could have been saved. And either way, the weight is crushing. The responsibility immense, and the fat man variant offers no comfort, no resolution, only the stark presentation of a choice that reveals the limits of moral theory, the inadequacy of simple principles, the irreducible difficulty of cases where values conflict, where any action involves loss, and the problem remains, a thought experiment that disturbs, that challenges, that refuses to yield easy answers, and that reminds us that morality is not a puzzle with solutions, but a practice requiring wisdom, courage, and the willingness to live with choices that are never fully justified, never free of doubt, never untainted by the recognition that whatever we do, someone suffers and we are responsible.